Alright, so the first mistake I see developers make when using the useEffect hook is not having a proper cleanup function. A cleanup function is a function that is run once your component is unmounted from the DOM. And usually what you want to do in this cleanup function is unsubscribe from event listeners, subscriptions, resize observers, or intervals. In an ideal case scenario, your component has run some effect function and you've had a very good cleanup function that unsubscribed that effect function. After the component has been unmounted, or rather your post render, when the component was reinitialized, you had a very clean initialization. But usually what you see is that you don't have really good cleanup functions. You have leftover event listeners, subscriptions, timers, and intervals, and these lingering side effects will carry on into the reinitialization of that component. So now let's take a look at some examples on how to properly write cleanup functions. Now let's say you had a window.add event listener. You added an event listener to the DOM, and this event listener was going to listen for a scroll, right? And once you are done writing this function, you didn't write a cleanup. So what will happen is that this will create lingering side effects. So when this component is reinitialized, that side effect sometimes still persists. And in this case, it can hamper performance. So what you want to do is write your window dot remove event listener. Now this removes the event listener once the component has been unmounted from the DOM, and then you can pass in an action that you want to run once this event listener has been removed. Perhaps is resetting the parameters that were inside of this function. Now, another example I would like to show you is with a resize observer. So I'm just going to create a ref for this illustration. Use ref, and inside of here I'll pass null. And because I'm using TypeScript, for type safety, I'm going to pass in HTML element here to properly type my ref or null. Alright, so the next example I'm going to show you is with a resize observer. So what you want to do is define your resize observer. Say new resize observer. And what we want to pass in here is a function that will be called when this change or when a change has been observed. I'll give you an example shortly. So let's take that example now. So we say the resize observer dot observe. So in this case, we want to observe a target element, as you can see here from the TypeScript IntelliSense, and that element will be our ref.current. And you can see that you have some red squiggly lines here, and the reason for that is the ref.current may not exist. So what we want is to check whether that exists. We say the resize observer.observe. If the ref.current exists, then we can then pass this observe function. And in the cleanup, what we say is likewise we replicate that, but we then say resize.onobserve. Right? Want to unobserve that. Say if ref.current. So you want to check if that DOM node exists before unobserving. Now this is a proper cleanup function of a resize observer, and you can apply this to so many more situations like set interval and then clear interval. So let's try that function. We say const new timer is equal to a set interval, and then this takes in some callback function, and then let's say it runs after every 1 second. So a really good cleanup function would be to clear that interval, and then we pass in the new timer. So these are some examples of how to properly write cleanup functions inside of React. In some cases, you would want to refactor out this resize observer, but for very simple use cases, you can leave it here as well. All right, so the second mistake I see developers make is not adding a dependency array. Even if you don't have any dependencies and you want a function to run only once, let's say for example console.log, let's say rendered component. Even if you want this to run just once, I would always recommend adding a dependency array. The reason is to future-proof your code. And secondly, if you don't add this dependency array, usually your code is more susceptible to having infinite loops, usually because this kind of effect will run on every render, and this effect will only run once the component has been mounted. And in this case, you do not need a return function, but if you'd want to add so as well, you can also add that return function. A console.log will not leave leftovers inside of your code, or nor will it have lingering side effects. The third mistake, and the most common one, is derived states. You do not want to be setting states inside of a useEffect. Usually, if you can offset it to a function call, I would recommend that. But in a case like this, you do not want to have set states inside of a useEffect, because this is very prone to infinite loops and infinite re-renders. Now, how do you then deal with derived states inside of React? React is dynamic. So what that means is that if a count change happens, we are observing that count and then we are setting the multiplier here. So what we can do is just then say const and then the multiplier, right, is equal to the count multiplied by 2. And then we can offset all of this entire code here, and then also offset useEffect. And this code is way cleaner. The multiplier will be updated whenever the count is updated. And another thing we can do here to also improve this code is, instead of using the count directly, for this count here, we want to get the previous value from the previous count, as opposed to getting this value of the count here. We want to get that previous value, and then we say the previous value plus 1. This is a better way to deal with states when you're dealing with values that are incrementing. So usually you don't want to have a set state inside of a useEffect. So set states inside of a useEffect. A useEffect is usually a warning sign that you're doing something wrong, or the code can be refactored in a better way. Is a warning sign. So the fourth mistake I see developers make is passing set states to children and then using that inside of a useEffect. Arguably, passing set states to a child component may not always be the best option. What you want to do is usually have an external state store or a state management solution like useSWR, or you want to use React inbuilt context and then set the states across your entire application, so that you can then use this inside of a hook like use context. Let's say, for example, const states is equal to use context, right? And then you then get the context from some context you've defined elsewhere, or you want to use a useSWR store, an external store. There's so many other solutions like Redux and so much more. You would want to always opt in for that kind of solution when you are dealing with things like this, because this can just lead to unnecessary re-renders. And the last mistake I see developers make is using effect to fetch data. Absolutely, if you ever have to use this effect to fetch data, I would recommend you don't even fetch data at all. But a better way to do it is to use server components like in Next.js. So this is a server component. You can fetch that data and then you pass it on to a client component. Another example you can use is useQuery. This is one of the better solutions. useQuery is a caching library, but it also works excellently well for data fetching. And what you want to do is fetch your data, you write your fetch to do function, you then fetch the data, and you have direct access to the data item, and then you can pass it over to your client component. And the last way is using useSWR, right? You can use the useSWR hook from SWR, right? And you can use this to fetch data as well. I've also added some other functions like revalidate on focus. So once the window has been unfocused and then is focused again, data refetches and also revalidates the data on reconnect, so when the user reconnects after being offline. Now, these are better ways of fetching data than trying to do it inside of a useEffect by yourself. I would not recommend writing useEffects on your own for fetching data, because it can get rather complex and there's a lot of use cases you will not account for. So these are all better solutions for fetching data inside of your application. I hope this video helps you in your journey in becoming a better React developer. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.